Robbins. Councillor Stephen Edwards.
Here, Karen.
Thank you. Councillor Rachel Ferguson.
Here, Karen.
Thank you. Councillor Christopher Jackson. Councillor Jackson, are you on the call?
Running late, Karen.
Okay, no problem. Alderman Derek Hussey.
Hi, Karen. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Dan Kelly.
On show, Karen.
Thank you. Alderman Keith Kerrigan.
Here, Karen.
Thank you. Councillor Rory McHugh.
Sure, Karen.
Councillor Maeve O'Neill.
Here, Karen.
Thank you. Alderman David Ramsey. Alderman Ramsey, are you here? Okay. And Councillor Brian Tierney.
Here, Karen.
Thank you. So Councillor Jackson and Alderman Ramsey,
I'm sure, Karen.
Oh, you're here. Okay, thank you. So that's fine. Chair, would you like me to do the statement of remote meetings?
Yes, if you don't mind, Karen, thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to remind everyone who is in remote attendance that this meeting will be broadcast live via Council's YouTube channel and will be available for viewing by the public and media. The broadcast will also be available for repeated viewing at a later date, and the broadcast may be terminated or suspended in accordance with Council protocol. Members and approved speakers are reminded to only have their mics and cameras on while speaking at the meeting, and to use the chat facility to highlight a request to speak. By participating in the meeting, you're consenting to being filmed and to the use and storage of those images for broadcasting or training purposes and for the purpose of keeping historical records and making those records available to the public. And a copy of the Council's privacy notice may be found on the Council website. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks for that, Karen. Members, item 4 is declarations of members' interest. If members would like to state now any interest, or alternatively, you can put them in the chat box as we move through the agenda. So, item 5 then is our presentation today, members, and I'd like to give a warm welcome to Mr. Brown and Mrs. Lawson from the Ulster Farmers Union, who are here today to present regarding climate change legislation. So, Mr. Brown and Ms. Lawson, you're both very welcome, and if you'd like to proceed, after which members will be asked to make comments or to put forward any questions or queries that they may have. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is stated on is David Brown. I'm Deputy President of the Ulster Farmers Union, and my colleague Aileen Lawson is Senior Policy Officer with responsibility for all matters environmental. So thank you for the invitation here today. I'm just going to give a brief introduction, and Aileen has a presentation which we'll run through, and we would certainly anticipate and hope that there'll be time to enable you to ask questions if you so wish. I suppose the first point really to sort of highlight, obviously the climate change is something that UFU has been very aware of. It's also something going back to last December, whenever the Climate Change Committee in the UK came forward with their 6th carbon budget, that we came out and very clearly stated that as far as we were concerned, we were supportive of the position that they had taken, and would obviously be part of working towards that climate change legislation. And just maybe to give you a little bit of background very briefly on that, is the fact that the UK was the first nation in the world actually to bring forward climate legislation as far back as 2008. At that time, within the industry here in Northern Ireland, there was a greenhouse gas implementation partnership set up, which UFU have been part of alongside other industry stakeholders and indeed the Department of Agriculture. So in 2019, Theresa May's government actually put net zero target into law. And the UK to date is the only country in the world to have developed a pathway towards net zero. I suppose I would want to just very quickly highlight the fact that whenever that sixth carbon budget came out, it's fair to say that some of our membership, I was rolled out as an office bearer on different radio shows and indeed on TV as well, with Conor Macaulay on BBC to indicate our views and our thoughts on it. And when you have statistics included in there, like 46% of land being released from agricultural production, 150,000 hectares, if you take into account that Northern Ireland has roughly 1 million hectares of area land, and 150,000 hectares were going to be proposed to be re-wet as peatland in order to enable it to better store the carbon that it had there. So all of those things were highlighted alongside movement towards obviously more agroforestry and so forth. And it's fair to say that that in itself, that target set by the CCC is a huge target for Northern Ireland, based on the fact that we have a rural and agricultural economy. The level of emissions from our agriculture as a percentage is higher than it would be in mainland GB. And that is off the back of the fact that so much of our rural economy is dependent on agriculture. So I'm going to hand over to Aileen, and I understand perhaps maybe you have received this presentation, but Aileen's going to run through that and then hand back to me, and then we'll take questions after that. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the Council for inviting us along today. So I'm going to give you a bit of background information and then set out some of our concerns that we have with the private members bill that's currently on the table. If you could just move the slide on, please. So just a bit of background. I mean, we're all aware that climate change is happening as a result of emissions to the atmosphere. And I suppose we would highlight, as David has already stated, that farming is very much on the front line of climate change impacts. You only need to look out the window today and we're facing extremely high temperatures here in Northern Ireland, and some of our farmers are facing drought conditions already in parts of the country, but where other parts of Europe are having devastating floods. So these types of extreme weather events will impact farmers more so, not just here in Northern Ireland, but across the whole world. And note that I suppose with a changing climate, our ability to produce food across the globe and to feed an increasing world population is going to be put under extreme pressure. But here in Northern Ireland, we are better placed to deal with a changing climate and to continue to produce high quality food. So we're very much on the page, as David has stated, that the EFU recognises the need to take action, the need to address climate change and reduce emissions from all of society, including the agri-food sector. And as you know, a lot of this is set out in global agreements, and there's been a lot of discussion around the Paris Agreement, which has set the global agenda on climate change, which will be reviewed in Glasgow this year. So there's a huge discussion going on, particularly this year, given that the COP26 on climate change will be held later. And just to note that part of that Paris Agreement also highlights the need to ensure food security. As the population grows, we're going to need to produce more and more food to keep up with the demand that is. So David has already talked about the Climate Change Act in the UK, which was the first nation in the world to set a climate change target and legislation. But another thing to note was, as part of that climate change legislation, it was a requirement to set up the Committee on Climate Change. And that Committee on Climate Change of world-renowned experts who are there independently to set emissions targets for the devolved regions and England based on evidence and using the best available science and information that they have available. And they're also there to scrutinise and watch what the various regions are doing and to report on that in terms of what actions they're taking. So we know that UK have a net zero target by 2050, which is set out to be delivered through carbon budgets, and these are reviewed every so many years. So just move on to the next slide, please. So just in terms of climate change inventories, greenhouse gas emissions in the UK, agriculture makes up about 10% of those emissions, but in Northern Ireland that figure is higher. As David said in his introduction, it ranges from sort of 26 to 28% depending on the year, but the reason being is that agri-food is a much greater importance to the Northern Ireland economy, and we do lack sort of other heavy industry and so forth to make up the difference in those emissions. So agriculture is the main emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in Northern Ireland. Just a few points to note, however, is that ammonia, which some of you may be aware of through planning and so forth, is not a greenhouse gas. Agriculture is measured on gross emissions, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But in terms of the emissions from agriculture, they are different from the other sectors because they are largely natural emissions and largely unavoidable in the process of producing food. So most of the emissions from agriculture are in the form of methane, which is emitted from ruminants, so cattle and sheep, when they're digesting their food. So it's much harder to deal with these natural emissions than it is, for example, carbon dioxide coming out of a power station or a car exhaust or whatever. So agriculture is known as a hard to treat sector in greenhouse gas terms. Just move on, please. So just in terms of gross emissions and net emissions, just to explain that a wee bit further, this diagram sort of shows agriculture in terms of climate change. So agriculture and forestry are unique in that they are the only sectors that can actually sequester or absorb carbon as such in society. So agriculture has a dual role. It produces emissions, but it also can sequester emissions. However, the way that legislative targets and national inventories, which account for emissions, are set up, agriculture gets no recognition for the sequestration role that it does. That all goes into a separate inventory, a separate account called land use and land use change. And it is used to offset all of society's emissions. So agriculture is purely measured just on what is coming out of the sector. So those red arrows on that diagram going up the way are all that is put into the agriculture inventory. The good work that is done on sequestering emissions is accounted elsewhere, and certainly we would challenge that, but we would like to see more recognition for agriculture to be recognised for what we sequester in our grassland, hedges and trees on farms, and offset our own emissions first before we would do so for the rest of society. And just move on, please. Again, David has highlighted the action that has been taken on farms in Northern Ireland. So for the last decade, we've been working with other partners in the agri-food sector and DERA and research institutes and so forth on a strategy to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and good progress has been made. So for example, our dairy farms in Northern Ireland have reduced carbon intensity by 34% since 1990. Should also highlight that our emissions in other sectors, so in our beef sector, UK emissions from beef farms are 52% below the global average. So we do have a positive story to tell in terms of what we are doing on farms. So there are benefits to be gained by improving production efficiencies on farms and reducing emissions. But in addition to that, there's been a lot more work recently, and we have hundreds of farms doing farm carbon audits, where they're measuring their carbon and doing various calculations around that. There are fantastic research projects ongoing, both in AFBI and Queen's, and there's some independent ones as well, based here, and looking at various aspects of the kind of climate change and agriculture issue. DERA are also working through a potential soil health scheme with a carbon element, which will actually, which we hope will to see getting up and running later this year. And that will set us out almost as a world leader in terms of establishing a baseline for carbon on farms, by measuring what we have in our soils and in our biomass and so forth. There's nothing like this proposed anywhere else in the world. So, we're very much supporting that work that's being carried out by DERA. There's renewable energy projects across farms. There's lots of tree and hedge planting, and there's new technologies constantly being introduced on farms. So it's not just to highlight, there's a lot of work has been going on over the years, and it continues to progress on tackling greenhouse gas emissions on our farms here. Move on, please. So just going on to the policy debate here in Northern Ireland. So as many of you are aware, the New Decade New Approach Agreement required that climate change legislation and targets would be set, and the Assembly declared a climate emergency last year. So as David has outlined, the Climate Change Committee, who are the independent experts on this issue, they outlined their 6th carbon budget back in December 2020. And at that time, they gave advice to the Minister that deep emissions reductions were needed in Northern Ireland, and they advised a target of 82% cut in greenhouse gas emissions in Northern Ireland by 2050. They believe that that was equivalent effort and a fair contribution to allow the UK overall to meet a net zero target by 2050. And the reason why we were given the 82% reduction was because they recognised the significance of the agri-food sector here in Northern Ireland as a major part of the economy, the difficulty of treating methane and greenhouse gases from agriculture, but also our contribution towards feeding the rest of the GB population. So in Northern Ireland, agri-food, we feed around 10 million people, the majority of which are in Great Britain. And the issue is basically the other parts of the UK will help offset some of the emissions from that food production here to allow the UK as a whole to hit net zero by 2050. So the other point that the Climate Change Committee highlighted, and it's a very important one, is that it's very important that you don't, in reaching climate change targets, you just don't simply export your emissions to another country. So it's very easy to hit net zero if you just get rid of all your livestock, but we still need to eat. So that product just gets brought in from somewhere else, and there's no benefit to climate, and global emissions will not change. And in fact, they are more than likely to increase because we are very efficient in terms of our production methods here in Northern Ireland compared to other regions in the world producing beef and milk in particular. Move on, please. So in terms of what that Climate Change Committee advice meant for agriculture alone, so as David suggested earlier, that 82% by 2050 is recognised as being extremely challenging for the whole of Northern Ireland. And what that means, and what the Climate Change Committee, they have identified a pathway for agriculture here, and they talk about a 57% reduction in our emissions from the agriculture sector by 2050 by adopting various technologies under sort of a heading of low carbon farming practices, but also, as David mentioned, a significant transformation in land use, which will be extremely challenging and will require or will likely result in some changes in livestock numbers as well. So that was very much a challenging pathway that was identified by the Climate Change Committee experts back at the back end of last year. Move on, please. And based on that advice from the Climate Change Committee, you'll probably be aware of the DERA consultation on climate change, and then the bill that has been developed by Minister Poots and adopted by the Executive, which has since been introduced recently to the Assembly. However, in the meantime, Claire Bailey from the Green Party, supported by a number of other parties, introduced a private members bill back in March. And that was supported by some environmental groups and community organisations under the banner of Climate Action NI. So that legislation that was drafted and presented to the Assembly and is now going through the scrutiny processes sets a net zero target for all greenhouse gas emissions by 2045. But in addition to greenhouse gas emissions, there are also targets on soil, water quality and biodiversity. There are nitrogen budgets. There's an introduction of a climate change commissioner, which we believe has very limited accountability. And one of the biggest concerns we have about this private members bill is that it was not compelled to have full public consultation before it was introduced. And it did not have an economic impact assessment or a rural needs assessment carried out before it was introduced into the Assembly. We believe it was the wrong mechanism to take forward this crucial legislation on climate change. Move on, please. So on the back of the private members bill, there was new advice issued by the Climate Change Committee experts back in April. And what they stated was that even with a 50% reduction in meat and dairy production in Northern Ireland and a significant increase in forestry, this would not be enough for Northern Ireland to hit net zero by 2050. So with 113,000 jobs in the agri-food sector, 5.2 billion industry, this, really raised our concerns around what this private members bill target could mean. In addition to the impact on agri-food sector, the Climate Change Committee also outlined significant additional costs to the Northern Ireland economy. So they were only able to give information because they've only looked at information up to 2050. So we can only sort of extrapolate that to get to the 2045 target. There'd be significant additional costs and reductions would be required, which have massive consequences to the Northern Ireland economy. I should also say that DAERA have also indicated that the difference between the Minister's bill or the Executive bill and the private members bill will only deliver, the private members bill will only deliver an additional 0.73% reduction in UK greenhouse gas emissions, but with significant additional consequences, particularly for the rural economy. Move on, please. So for us, just the key issues around the private members bill on climate change is that we do not believe that net zero by 2045 is an acceptable target. It is against the independent expert advice, and Lord Devon of the Climate Change Committee chairman has stated in his evidence to the committee at Stormont that it's morally wrong, the target is unachievable, and it's also scientifically impossible in Northern Ireland. While there is lots of new technologies and so forth, what we know at the minute will only get, and introducing those on farms, low carbon farming methods would not get us anywhere near the 2045 target. So it's not, we cannot rely on technology and so forth to deliver the action that would get net zero by 2045. So it would have to require devastating reductions in ruminants in Northern Ireland in order to get that. And the impact, as I said earlier, on farms, on rural communities and the Northern Ireland economy would be massive. There's also a threat to food security. So if it's not produced here, then you're relying on imports, and there's obviously concerns around that. And we saw those issues creeping in at the start of lockdown when COVID hit. The other thing to point out is that, and this is not just our information, this is based on expert advice, is that this 2045 is unlikely to have any reduction in global emissions because, as I said earlier, meat and dairy products will still be demanded by the consumer and they'll simply be imported from overseas. And we know that is likely to come from regions where standards are lower in terms of both the environment and animal health and welfare, and emissions are higher. So it will result simply in carbon leakage with no benefit to the global environment. And as I said earlier, no economic impact assessment or rural needs assessment has been carried out for the private members bill. So one of the key terminologies around climate change is the need for a just transition. We do not believe that this private members bill will deliver a just transition for rural communities and farmers, and we believe that the burden will fall with the rural community if this 2045 figure is adopted. There are also questions around methane, which is largely produced by cattle and sheep. Methane is a short-lived greenhouse gas. It reacts differently to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and therefore there's questions over how it should be treated, and that needs to be investigated further. I've also pointed out that agriculture should be measured on net emissions and given proper recognition for sequestration on farms as well. The Climate Change Commissioner's role and accountability and their powers need to be appropriate, and we will have some questions over the powers that have been set out in the private members bill. So a lot of political parties try to reassure farmers by saying that the private members bill is simply a framework bill. Yes, it's a framework bill, but framework bills are there to set policy direction. And in order to meet that legislative target within that framework, then there will be significant action would be needed in agri-food to deliver that 2045 net zero target. And move on, please. So I suppose one of the things that, because we have had such huge concerns around the private members bill and the lack of scrutiny in terms of economic impact assessment, that isn't there. There's so little information around it. We, along with other industry organisations, have commissioned the consultants, KPMG, to carry out an economic impact assessment on the 2045 target. And that work is underway, and we are due the final report any day. What I can tell you is that the interim findings of the KPMG work has told us that in order to meet the 2045 net zero target in Northern Ireland, there would need to be in and around an 85% reduction in livestock, and that will largely be, that 85% will largely be in cattle and sheep. And that really takes us back to 1946 levels of dairy cows, or numbers of dairy cows, and it would be the lowest number of cattle in Northern Ireland that have ever been recorded if we do that, if we have to make those reductions to meet this 2045 target. So you can see that those figures will have massive consequences for rural areas, for rural communities, and the economy as a whole. It's important to realise that you know, that work will be published later this year, or sorry, later this month, and we will be making you aware of that. And I'll just hand over now to David to make the summary. If you could move on to the last slide, please.
Apologies, folk. There, it took me a second or two to find my video back on again. But thank you, Aileen. I mean, the reality of it is, I mean, just even as we went through some of that, you know, to throw in a few thoughts before I turn to just the conclusions. Beef emissions, and it's been referenced a number of times, the emissions that are so much less in terms of our production system. We have a grass-based system in Northern Ireland, which is unique in Western Europe. A lot of other areas of the world where, for example, beef and milk is produced and ruminant produce is produced is much more intensive feedlot type systems. So we have a grass-based system, and as Aileen has already alluded to, the emissions, for example, from our beef sector is less than half of the world average. If we were, and we hear a lot about Brazil and rainforests and so on, if we were to import that, replace that meat produced in Northern Ireland by bringing it in from Brazil, the emissions are more than 4 times what they are from production here in Northern Ireland. The other factor to not lose sight of is the fact that GB in the UK overall is in around 60% self-sufficient in food production. So sure as night follows day, people will still need fed. If that production does not take place within the UK, and indeed Ireland for that matter, because in reality our colleagues in Southern Ireland supply a lot of that food into the GB marketplace and are in a very similar difficult position in terms of the emissions and challenges that they have. But just one other point to highlight, because part of the discussions we've had with some of the parties has been around the statement that they make that, you know, we're not trying to target the small family farms. You know, we're more concerned about the intensive farms. And it has already been pointed out, emissions, over 90% of them are from cattle and sheep. The pigs and poultry, which are normally described as the intensive sectors, have a very, very small contribution because they are not ruminants. They do not chew their cud, if to put it in agricultural terms, and produce the methane and greenhouse gases that the ruminants do. So to think that this is not targeting intensive sectors is very misplaced, because sadly the reality of it is, or to think that this is, you know, targeting intensive sectors is misplaced, because in reality, if it is the cattle and the sheep, those are the small rural farms which we defend, you know, as not only providing food, but also providing the landscape and the environment that we all enjoy, the hillsides and the mountains and all the rest of it where those sheep are raised. So just in conclusion, UFU is absolutely not opposed to reducing emissions. That's why we signed up and indicated our support back in December for the 6th carbon budget brought forward by the CCC. And I suppose really ultimately, and you know, at the end of the day, it's fundamentally our concerns are that the decimation of our agricultural industry here in Northern Ireland by legislation which will create targets which we will be forced to comply with, because once you put something into law, the reason for law, as you will understand quite rightly, is in order to enforce something. So therefore, once this becomes law, and whether that be the private members bill or indeed any climate legislation for that matter, therefore the agri sector, along with other sectors, will have to work towards meeting those targets. And I think just finally, I would want to say that, you know, ultimately the real concern we have, and you're probably also aware around pieces to do with importation and trade deals that the UK government is currently doing. I mean, we have concerns around that in terms of the standards of the production systems that exist, but more concerning in relation to climate change specifically. Those trade deals at present are not taking into account the fact that production in another part of the world is producing much more emissions. And we need not forget that Northern Ireland is not sitting in, or Ireland for that matter, is not sitting in a little bubble with the climate just above our little island, because the beautiful, it's not called the Emerald Isle for nothing. That green and pleasant landscape that we have is created and formed by the farming and agricultural activity that takes place on it. And it is done in the most efficient manner of food production in the world. And that's, I suppose, what we as an Ulster Farmers Union are trying to defend. So that's a conclusion to all I wish to say. But please feel free if anyone wishes to ask either Aileen or myself questions, which we will do our best to answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both, Aileen and David, for what was a very comprehensive presentation on a very important issue. I say that speaking from Castledairg, which has just reached the highest temperature ever recorded since records began in the north, of 31.3 degrees, I think it is. So it shows you just how important it is. Members, I'm going to open it to the floor now for members' questions and comments. So if you just indicate in the chat box, please. Councillor Kerrigan.
Thank you, Chair. And I was going to let somebody else come in first, but I can give it a wee rattle now. For I do thank David and Aileen for the report, and I do agree with you, Chair. It's we are very warm and Castledairg, but still that didn't stop me having to take sandbags to a man on Monday evening with water. So, but that's another thing. So we can still have plenty of maybe plenty of dry spots up in County Down, but we can still have our own wee wet spots. But Chair, we have had back and forward here in regards to this, and we have mentioned this. I have a number of wee points here. For more than crab it kind of the day, Chair, to be fair, but it's just in the way of it there. When you hear the figures and you hear the damage that will be done to the agricultural sector, it's desperate altogether, and it seems to be a thing that you know, the farmers haven't been brought along. You know, this seems to be another thing here, and I'm just wondering here if David and Aileen here would agree with a certain extent. If this comes into law and if this is passed here, this obviously then falls down the line to your whatever form of subsidy there is, be it basic, whatever type of basic payment, single farm payment, whatever name or whatever it is given to now, because the subsidy is there for the production of cheaper foods, so that we're not paying more for the foodstuffs in the supermarket. Therefore, there's a subsidy then provided to those in the agricultural sector. And the gist of it is then, and maybe you can see if that's right with this point here, that you know everybody has to jump through hoops If you're relying on your subsidies there, you have to jump through hoops, and whatever you're told to do, you have to jump through it, or else you're penalised. You're penalised. You're always steady in the noose, and it depends how tight it is, and you just have to jump through whatever hoops it is. And that's the thing. I mean, the amount of red tape and all that's drafted in, and this is just more red tape. This is just more hassle. We understand stuff has got to be done, but it's the case there that it's going to cause, for the people that are out trying to farm, it's going to cause major issues. Because you've got to be brought on board. I'm just wondering about how much consultation. I'll give you a list of wee questions here. How much consultation you've had in regards to Claire Bailey's bill, and if there's any particular comments on that one. Again, I did hear some comments as to some remarks that you had made. I was aware of some things there. Again, I would fully agree and fully endorse your comments. I would ask the question, you see, have you got figures here? You're on about the net emissions here. And again, agriculture seems to be the sector that is being pushed here that to try and reduce, and as you're saying here, that's the that's the livestock. And I mean, that's a natural producing there, the methane there. You can't do anything about that. You know, I'm just wondering there in regards to that there, you're on about the net, the emissions that are being ruled out. Have we a percentage for that? You're on about that we could have potentially 26 to 28% emissions there, depending on the year. Northern Ireland, where the UK average is 10%. I'm just wondering, have we any figures there, any percentage figures as to how much is the agriculture offsetting? You know, because I mean, transport there in that documentation was sitting as 21, and again, you know, they're not offset. I'm wondering, you know, what we would be offsetting is one question there. Right, trying to see my other figures there. I'm wondering there, is there anything in your opinion there that we could do as a council to try to assist in regards this? I'm thinking about so that's one thing here. Another question there is, we have a climate emergency committee here, or climate bill, and different things there in regards in the council itself. I'm just wondering what contact you have had with them, or what contact then they have made with yourselves. Again, fully endorse your comments there. There's no point passing the buck to somebody else trying to reduce our, because I mean, we've had all the debates and we've had all the discussions there about Brazilian beef and various things such as that. And I mean, what's the point in us saying, oh, look how great we are, our climate, our figures are down to net zero, but yet you're bringing in tons and tons of meat out of South America and places like that. Again, I'm very surprised to hear there in this the lack of full public consultation on Claire Bailey's bill and the rural impact assessment, or the lack of it, as you've mentioned. We as this council have a rural issues group set up, and it was a policy of this council, and it's been reiterated on many occasions by members, that everything would have to get, you know, that it would be assessed from the rural end, and yet this has no impact, nothing at all in regards, no lookout as to what's done with it. Seems very much along the lines of, this is what we want done. It's sort of a dictate that's been put down. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, Head Keith.
Sorry, I'm just seeing here of a couple other wee points there, right? Single farm payment, powers of the Climate Change Commission around about that. The need to work with the farming community and bring them on board and input onto it. And an 85% reduction in livestock there, that's desperate altogether. I mean, we're sitting there, you know, my figures there from what I've looked out there, we have about 1.6 million cattle. As at June 19, I was looking at statistics. That would knock us down to 240,000 head of cattle, and knock us down from about 940,000 ewes down to 140,000. That would have a massive impact. I mean, I know the average milk, the dairy herd there is up there to just over the 100 now, and it was a number of years ago from it was under that, you know. But I mean, are you chatting that the average milk dairy herd down to 15? Wouldn't be viable. Couldn't be economically viable. And the final wee point I'll just make on to you, David, is do they not realise that the agricultural sector, the farmer is not a miser. I've never seen a man sitting there with money now. If the farmer ever got money, it was always spent. Somebody got a turn out of it. Should that have been a digger man? Should that have been a man out fencing? Should that have been a man out there with concrete to build or re-roof in a shade or something? It fed into so many other sectors. It wasn't solely in the production of food. Agricultural contractors, everything's knocked on. There's a massive amount of work. The farmer doesn't, if he gets a grant, he doesn't hold on to it. You know, it's that there. Has there been any consideration, or in your opinion, has there been any consideration into that to try to scope, you know, how many other sectors are impacted? You know, if you wipe out the farmer here, you're wiping out a wild amount of people here, you know, and I'm just more than annoyed about it here. I'll tell you no lie, and I could say far more, and it could get far worse, but I think you know, very much on your side here, David Nealing, but I just sorry, I'll let you go on now. And
right, well, I'll attempt, Keith, to, I've been making notes, but I'm nearly running out of paper, but I've got to, I'll try my best to come back on each of the points. Aileen, I'm warning you, I'm coming back to you with the net emissions one, and if there's anything I've missed, but just, I mean, first and foremost, just for, and like this is an education to me, I have to admit, despite 3 years in the Ulster Farmers Union, I was not aware that until very recently, private members' bills do not have to have rural or impact assessments. You can bounce them into Stormont at will if you're an MLA and can get the support to do so. So they do not have to have it. That is why we're spending quite a lot of money, our members' money, in order to do that assessment, or at least KPMG are doing it for us. In relation to dairy, you referenced the fact, you know, if you were down that level, the reality of it is roughly around 15% of our dairy goes into liquid milk. The rest, as you might appreciate, or any dairy farmers that may be among you would appreciate, is processed. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the processing sector, well, if you want to put it bluntly, it would be unnecessary, because we wouldn't be making cheese, we wouldn't be making butter, we wouldn't be making any of the produce that we make from milk, because we would not have the supply of it. We would need that balance just to supply the liquid market. In terms of other employment, Keith, yes, very much focused, because at the end of the day, the agricultural industry both is supplied and supplies to, at the other end, the employment that takes place in terms of those who service it. And that's right across, you know, machinery sales, feed, you name it. Like in terms of inputs that come into farms, that if you reduce the ability of farms to produce and indeed reduce their ability, obviously, to have a viable business, that would have a very significant impact on wider employment. You asked, had we any consultation with Claire? It's fair to her credit, Claire has not hidden. We have had a number of meetings with her. I have had a number of interviews where she has been on, I suppose, making her case, and I'm making mine. And she's been quite direct in saying that she has no concern really about reducing food production in Northern Ireland. We've made the points to her, just as we have today to you as a council group. In terms of, is there anything you can do as a council? I think the fact that you've invited us along indicates a level of interest that we have had from a number of others, but equally we're more than willing to come along and explain, I suppose, the background. Unfortunately, at times, the sound bites that you might hear on the radio or on TV tend to not fully, I suppose, demonstrate the whole of the picture. But really, in relation to the net emissions, I'm going to hand back to Aileen there. And if I've forgotten anything that Keith has asked me there, I don't know, Aileen, if you can remember them. But and Keith, feel free to come back again if you so wish.
Just in terms of net emissions, you know, there are figures around what is sequestered, but it doesn't include everything. So hedges aren't counted, for example, at the minute. So one of the things I mentioned in the presentation was that DAERA are proposing to do a soil health scheme, which will include measuring carbon in soils, but also biomass, and by that I mean the trees and hedges and so forth on farms. So we will have a proper baseline of what it can be sequestered potentially on Northern Ireland farms, and there's a lot of research going into this area. So it's still early days, but should that project go ahead that DAERA are leading, we'll be the first region in the world to have detailed baseline in terms of our soil carbon and our carbon in above ground biomass, which will give us a really good indication of the potential for sequestration to offset emissions from the sector going forward. There are some individual projects and stuff being done on farms at a, you know, on a small level, but this would be done across every farm. So it's a really positive action that hopefully is going to be delivered later this year.
Just maybe very quickly to add to that, Keith, I mean, the real concern, and we've been making this case, as have others in GB and indeed in ROI as well, that the sequestration is not being credited to agriculture currently under the current inventories. So as the president of the UFU pointed out when we were before the ERA committee, he has planted on his farm in recent years somewhere between 4 and 5 miles of hedges. I've planted somewhere close between 2 or 3 miles of hedges and planted trees and so on. But I get no credit for that because that goes towards, well, basically transport or those other sectors that you reference. So in other words, it's for the good of society. It's not for the good of what I might, or balancing out the other side of the equation for what I may produce on my farm. That's something that we feel is fundamentally unfair and needs to be looked at.
Just very briefly, Chair, just to respond, I fully thanks very much for your comments there. And it's just the case that it's seems very much like, you know, farmers have to do the work to try to counter it here. Get no credit for it, but we're expected that you just have to pick up the tag and just follow suit here in this one. There, this is the thing sort of as a grieving in my eyes there, that, you know, you're not getting any credit, as you say, for the hedges, for the maintenance of it, you know, but you're just expected to do it and just reduce what is our farming, you know, the farming activities. And, you know, it just seems to be a dictate from ones that know nothing about it. And that's just my own eyes there. I've know nothing about the actual, the farming end of things. But thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Alderman Kerrigan. And I think I speak for everybody. I want to say, I think you put up a fairly stern defence of your fellow farmers there. So you did. Our next speaker on the list is Councillor O'Neill. Councillor O'Neill.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I'd like to welcome the positive steps that are already being taken and those projects that you mentioned in the agricultural sector to address the climate crisis. And I have spoken with local farmers to learn more. And speaking with people in the farming community, the farmers I have spoke with stand ready to tackle climate change, because as you have stated, farmers know that extreme weather conditions and biodiversity loss and even inconsistent weather patterns, all features of climate breakdown, it's not good for farming. But, you know, this is an urgent crisis. We've got 5 to 10 years to truly make a difference. So the difference between 2045 and 2050, I feel, is irrelevant, you know, because, you know, there's urgent action that needs to be taken to arrest climate change. And farmers know that we'll need all hands to the pump. But what I worry about is the corporate forces that are dictating farming policy, that don't have the interest of farming, family farmers and small farms at heart. And this is corporate processing companies, corporate food wholesalers, and corporate food retailers. And I feel the whole ethos of the corporate control of farming is to produce cheap foods, no matter what it costs to the planet, so that the profits are high. And we've seen, you know, the evidence of that is we've seen some supermarkets half-year profits reach over £1 billion. And so, like, I ask myself, like, the question, why wouldn't corporate interests want to continue with this business as usual model in the current agricultural sector, as it's clearly working well for them? But if we're going to address the climate crisis that we're in, we can't continue the business as usual, nor the small incremental changes that, you know, haven't really made much of a difference. I think one thing, you know, that is important to mention, which hasn't been mentioned yet, that's going to be instrumental in supporting farmers to address the climate crisis, is the Northern Ireland Farm Welfare Bill, which is currently with the Agricultural Committee. And this is going to return family farmers a minimum of the cost of production, inflation linked, plus a margin for their produce. And, you know, this is not to increase the cost of food beyond normal inflation prices, but what it is going to do is force corporates to lower their profits. And, you know, in terms of, you know, the case for farmers at the moment, like a study in 2013 showed that a quarter of farming families are living below the poverty line. And although there's been no updated research, this has gotten worse from subjectively speaking to the farming community. And 60% of the farmers in the north are also working part-time. So they're already subsidising the price of our food by having part-time jobs. And this is the same picture of wealth inequality that seems to exist in every aspect of society here. Farmers need proper returns for their produce, because when they get this, they can then invest in the green solutions that already exist in the agricultural sector, and this can allow a transition from fossil fuels used in farming to reduce emissions. So I'm supportive of the private member climate change bill. I feel it's enabling. It's not to wipe out the farmer here, in the words of Councillor Kerrigan, but in tandem with the NI Farm Welfare Bill, it's going to support family farmers and the food sovereignty of our population here. And it has been supported by other farming groups like the Northern Ireland Agricultural Producers Association and Farmers for Action. And Aileen, you have mentioned a just transition, and I totally agree and support with that. I think, consultation with farmers is integral, and a just transition needs to be part of that. But I suppose you have mentioned as well the need to continue to produce food for the people of these islands. However, I'm aware of agricultural deals which say almost 3 million tons of grains per year imported from Brazil to feed the intensive farming sector, whose meat then gets shipped to China. So, and then we're left with the ship really, which the corporates make a massive profits, and the food produce being sold for dirt cheap, and that's not sustainable farming. And our governments are supposed to exist to serve our people, but instead they just seem to be serving the needs of corporations at the expense of ordinary people. And I just have a few specific questions for yourselves in relation to the stats there. What is the essential difference in the impacts of the zero carbon versus an 82% reduction? And given that these are enabling bills with no sectoral details, how did you quantify those impacts? And kind of further that point, the department's policy is at least an 82% reduction by 2050, but we should go for the highest achievable greenhouse gas reduction. And the CCC recommends an 82% reduction, but also says a 94% reduction as achievable. So does Ulster Farmers Union support a 94% reduction by 2050? And if not, what's the difference in the impacts on the agri-food sector between 82% reduction and a 94% reduction? And how is that quantified? Is it fair that the North should adopt a target that is less stringent than what the CCC thinks is achievable? And just finally, if you can disclose, I was just wondering who funded the KPMG report, which I do look forward to reading. So I also did want to make a proposal, but I can do that at the end, because I would love to hear from the other people in the farming sector as well who are supportive of the private members bill. Thank you.
Okay, I'll maybe start when it comes back to Aileen again. I'm warning you coming back in relation to the 82% and 94% on the difference between that aspect of it. Just may have to answer a couple of points. Well, just to correct a couple of points. NIAPA are totally against the private members bill, so that's a piece of misinformation, unfortunately, that you've received. Farmers for Action, that has around about 20 members. We have 11,500 family members. Farmers for Action have brought forward the welfare bill that you described, the farm welfare bill. I don't know if you're aware or not, but that's basically going nowhere because DERA have rubbished it, and in effect it's not going to get the support that would be necessary for it to proceed. In relation to the point you make about cheap food and corporate, couldn't agree more with you. The Common Agricultural Policy was designed, and I mean the support, and Keith referenced earlier the financial support or subsidies that has come into agriculture. It was designed post-war to provide a cheap food policy. That cheap food policy still exists in Europe. It certainly exists in GB, and therefore the supermarkets and those who have achieved a position of power certainly make good use of that in terms of keeping the prices of our food down. But the reality of it is, if they don't feed people on produce produced in Ireland, either north or south for that matter, they will feed the people. The supermarket shelves will not be allowed to be empty. So the point that we've been trying to make in our presentation is that that food will come from somewhere else in the world. That will have a detrimental impact on the climate, because those countries that produce that food are producing higher and more emissions than we are in Ireland, or indeed GB for that matter. In relation to your point about us importing in order to export, there is a level of import and export in every nation in the world. But just so you fully understand, the UK is around about 55% self-sufficient in pork. So if there's feed brought in to feed the pigs, it is because we are not self-sufficient in pork. Equally, in terms of poultry, we're around about 75% self-sufficient in poultry, 75% self-sufficient in beef. So there is exports to China, but what you need to understand is that what happens in relation to parts of the animal, without going into the nitty-gritty details of it, there are parts of all animals that are not palatable in the UK or GB or in Ireland for that matter. And those parts of the animals are, of course, exported to parts of the world that will eat pig's trotters, pig's heads, and other things of that nature. So in terms of feeding our own nation, that precisely is the difficulty we have. If we do not feed it from within the country, then it will be fed from without, with a detrimental impact on global emissions. You do make the point that you feel it's irrelevant, the difference between 2040 and 2050. I suppose that's why we came along here today, to make the point to you that 2050 on the CCC's 82%, which I'll bring Aileen in a moment, is indicated to try and, I suppose, continue to feed the UK, but equally recognition of the fact that if you go into the middle of England, and I talked about our Emerald Isle, if you go into the middle of England, you have vast, vast tracts of arable land. They do not have the livestock. And livestock, and I'm saying this in I suppose in one sense against myself as a farmer who farms beef and sheep in West Fermanagh, those livestock are what produce these emissions in agriculture, in the agricultural sector. And therefore, you know, I mean, we can, I suppose, in some ways look forward to technical improvements which will reduce those emissions, but will not mitigate them. In terms of methane, it is a flow gas that is recycled every 10 to 12 years. We didn't go into all of the detail of that, but that is something which we feel is, again, not a fair comparison with carbon dioxide and the other nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gases emitted from the tailpipe of your exhaust or whatever else, which at the end of the day has come from fossil fuels. Who funded the KPMG? And then I'm coming to you, Aileen. That has been funded by the agri-food industry. That includes ourselves, the Ulster Farmers Union. It includes the Northern Ireland Meat Exporters Association, the Dairy Council for Northern Ireland, the Pork and Bacon Forum, and the Grain Trade. So it involves all of the people who know that any impact directly on farmers, which this bill will have, will directly and immediately impact on them, on the employment and the businesses that they have. So Aileen, if you want to maybe cover that 82% comparison with the 94 and so forth from the CCC.
Yeah, I just want to add to what you said, David, in terms of why the funding of the KPMG report. I should also highlight that it's been supported by NIAPA, the Northern Ireland Agricultural Producers Association, the National Beef Association, the National Sheep Association, the vets organisations here in the north, and also I think that maybe I've covered everybody there, but there's also a lot of people in the background of that report as well. So who are working with us through the analysis. In terms of the 82% and so forth, we have quantified. So I suppose what has happened in the UK is that the Climate Change Committee set out balanced pathways and looked at other pathways to achieve different targets for the different regions and so forth. And they set their targets accordingly. What's happening in other parts of the world is they set a target first and are working backwards to try then and find a pathway to hit that target. So that's, I suppose, a difference in maybe where we are, you know, north and south of the border. In terms of what the analysis we're doing, we know from research and from expert advice and so forth what technologies are currently available that could be adopted, what may be available in the next number of years that could help reduce emissions. But we know that that will only deliver about 20% reduction in livestock emissions at this time. So in order to hit the 2045 target, because it is such a tight target and so early, then you would need to take very drastic action very soon. So what we're saying is the Climate Change Committee's advice of at least 82% as a balanced pathway to get there allows room to revise that target if the technology, and research delivers improvements and achievements in due course. The 2045 is too hard too soon. It will not give us the flexibility it'll require livestock cuts early on. And again, just to re-emphasize, those livestock cuts will not come from the intensive sectors in terms of pig and poultry, because they don't produce greenhouse gases. They will come from cattle and sheep, small family farms, and particularly in marginal areas, particularly in our uplands, and in our less favoured areas, which tends to be in the west of the province. Those are where those livestock cuts will come earliest and hardest, because those farms are in more marginal areas and profitability is tighter. So that's what will happen, and that's what expert analysis has suggested will need to happen to hit these earlier targets. So that's what we're just trying to explain to you now. And in terms of 82% compared to 94%, I think what the Climate Change Committee have clearly recommended is you're better to set a target that you know is achievable. And they say 82% is a fair target and it's an achievable target. To go beyond that is just putting everybody into a straitjacket. But revise your targets as technology and research and knowledge improves as we go forward, and hopefully there will be developments and so forth that will allow us to reduce our emissions sooner and faster from our agri-food sector. But we're not there yet, and we need the room and the flexibility within legislation to be able to develop those new technologies to do so.
Okay, thanks for that, Aileen, and thank you, Councillor O'Neill. Next on the list, we have Alderman Ramsey.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much, David and Aileen, for coming here today. There's a true saying that every day is a school day, and we've talked about climate emergency, and we've been talking for a long time now, and this is the first time that I have actually heard exactly what this bill will mean to our food industry going forward in our farming industry. And I understand your frustrations, because listening to Councillor O'Neill there, it's obvious that you are having very, very much difficulty in getting through to people on how this is going to devastate this entire community that we live in today if this bill goes through and attempts are made to reduce basically our stock by 85%. The thing about a member's bill is it kind of reminds me of motions that go to our council. Sometimes not a lot of thought put into them, and eventually somebody decides we'll send a letter. It's like it doesn't have teeth, and somebody else then ends up having to go and fight for what's right for the people. Self-sustainability is very important for any nation, and the UK and I know Ireland as well are the same, where they have a major they have the farming industry to protect the food industry that we don't have to import, and self-sustainability is extremely important for any country. And to think that the work that goes into the food that's put on our tables, and the good food that's put on our tables, which we have no worries about quality. And the farming industry is so well governed that to basically turn around and it's like taking the wheels out of the ocean. We're going to take the stock, the cattle, the sheep off the fields. What are we going to be left with? We're going to be left with total devastation. And we talk about climate emergency and climate change. There would be some devastation in our climate if we decide that we're going to import everything to do with our food industry when it comes to our meats. And I just want to, as somebody who's not a farmer, but was fortunate enough at a younger age to work on a local spud farm, and where I learnt my work ethic, because that's where I learned how difficult and how hard it is to work on a farm and how hard it is to get our food on the table. I just want to lend my support and give my support to yourselves and the good work you're obviously doing to protect the food that we eat, and also to the farmers. And I'd like to thank Keith there, who my colleague there, who was very, very forthright and very, very well schooled on exactly what he was saying. And we need this fight. We need this fight for the farming industry. We need this for the preservation of our countryside. We need this for the preservation of our good health going forward. And the targets, yes, we are all up for targets, but this is definitely not thought out. And I look forward to whenever you get all the expert analysis and results, and we'll see then where all these campaigners go with the fact that we could end up with 15% of the current stock. In other words, we no longer would be able to farm our lands. So I just want to give my support and thank you very much for coming today.
Thank
you, Alderman Ramsey. I don't think there was an actual question there, so I'll move on to Alderman Guy.
Thank you, Chair, for letting me in. I'm not a member of this committee. Thanks to David and Eileen for the presentation. Very interesting and informative. A lot of stuff on there that I haven't heard before now. I also sit in a climate emergency group with Alderman Kerrigan, and we are both always trying to push that the agriculture sector be more involved, even with that committee, because when you're dealing with food production and stuff like that there, you know, and the agri sector, the farmers need brought along as well, and they need listened to. But look, in Northern Ireland, around 30% of greenhouse emissions emanate from the agri sector, with the vast majority coming from food sources, which will be needed more, possibly taking into consideration the ongoing problems with the NI protocol. And can we really afford to reduce meat and dairy produce production? Greenhouse gases back in 1998 were reported to be 5,780 odd kilotons of CO2. In 2018, that was reduced to a reported 5,313 kilotons. That's only 470 kilotons drop in 20 years. Yet, with this bill, they want it to be zero emissions by 2045. It's simply not possible. I also believe that the 82% by 2050, let's say, could be slightly more achievable, maybe more realistic. But I'd like to ask David, what do you see? And I know you mentioned there the 50%, 57% by 2050 that it should reach in the presentation. But what do you see as a more realistic figure that should be worked to? And what amendments to the content of the legislation would you like to see changed? Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Darren. I suppose, look, I mean, well, I'll repeat, maybe Eileen referenced some of the comments by the chair of the CCC panel when he appeared in front of the IRA committee to be quizzed around the 82% versus their, or the suggestion of some of the members of that committee who support the bill. He used words, and these are direct quotes. You can look them up on Stormont. The emissions that they put out in terms of, I suppose, recording theirs, just as you're doing today. They talked about it being unachievable, being unscientific, being morally wrong, unethically, and there was no credible route beyond the 82% by 2050. I would have to say probably the alarm bells really rang with us back earlier in the springtime, while we'd come out initially, to say, okay, we recognise the need for agriculture to be part of the solution. The sequestration, we want to see credited to agriculture in terms of our hedgerows and our grasslands and so forth. That's currently not happening. But on the other side of that, we do recognise that in terms of emissions, it's not just a case of saying, well, we can balance one with the other. We can't, because in reality, the emissions in agriculture, as has been described earlier, are natural emissions. They're biological emissions, and without going into the wording that we might choose to use, the cows burp, and that's producing those emissions. But in fact, I think really the alarm bells rang for us whenever there was a further response on the back of the private members bill. When it came forward, the Lord Debon and the Climate Change Committee were asked to take a look at it, and he came forward and said that even with a 50% cut, we could not reach net zero by 2050, never mind 2045. So therefore, immediately, that the alarm bells that we, I suppose, had as an industry was, well, if that's what they're saying. Now, it wasn't entirely palatable, Darren, I'd have to confess to you, for some of our members, that we as a UFU come out, because at the end of the day, you're speaking on behalf of 11,500 farming families. Many of those farming families have a husband, a wife, a son, a daughter, involved in the farm. So there's 30, 40,000 people here you're talking on behalf of. And when we said that we recognised and accepted the recommendations of the CCC panel, that was fine until they discovered what those recommendations were, because if you talked about, as I mentioned earlier, the reduction in terms of 46% of land being removed from productivity to other things, to forestry, agroforestry, and also alongside that 150,000 hectares, which is a lot of acres, 2.5 acres per hectare, being re-wet, peatland being re-wet. Basically that means it's no longer farmable. And we know that our peatlands on our hillsides, Aileen has alluded to the impact this would have in LFA and in hill areas, the small family farms, indeed many of them part-time farms, because ultimately if that happens, as described even within the recommendations to get to 82%, it will have a huge impact on those hill farms, because ultimately they will find themselves in a position where that land can no longer graze sheep or sustain sheep. So in every respect, I guess, the concerns and the alarm bells have been ringing, right the way through from December. But when the private members bill, and I'll be honest, we had some discussions, but we didn't know it was coming till it sort of dropped from on high on us. And immediately we started to investigate the implications of that. And the implications, as have been described over the last hour, were severe and extremely, well, I can't put it any stronger to say devastating to the current agricultural industry that we have. But in terms of us and the things that we need and can do, we're talking about technological solutions, which in many cases are being worked on. We're blessed with having AFBI, the Food Bioscience Institute up at Hillsborough, and indeed others, Rothamsted and other institutions that are working on feed additives and other things which can reduce emissions. And I say reduce, not get rid of them. And all of those things, every single one of them, are going to be needed to get us to 82% and more along with them. And I think that's the difficulty we have with this, is that to predicate a decision that we would go to 100% by 2045 on the possibility that we might find some way of doing it is not something we would wish to see put into legislation. Aileen, I don't know if there's anything you'd wish to add to that, but maybe I've waffled a bit. My apologies, Darren.
I think you've covered it well. I think it's just, as one farmer put it to me, I was spooked when I saw the Climate Change Committee and the DERA recommendations, but I'm absolutely terrified of this private members bill and what it means for my business. So I think that sums up the difference between the two different pieces of legislation. They're both one's very challenging and the other's pretty much impossible, and will have devastating impacts. And there are going to be impacts, but there is a need to tackle climate change. It's just finding that balance. But the last thing we want to do is actually export all of our farmers, or export our industry overseas where emissions will be higher and actually make no difference to the climate. So it's getting the thing right that actually delivers for climate change, delivers for farmers, delivers for the economy, and delivers for society. And that's the fine line that we try to tread, and you refine that as technology and research develops over future years.
Yeah, I suppose, Darren, in conclusion, if I was to be provocative, I would make the point that you would be much better producing more food in Northern Ireland rather than less, based on the fact that we have much lower emissions. Because at the end of the day, we need to keep reminding ourselves this is a global issue. It is not something hanging over the head of Northern Ireland or the UK or Ireland as a whole.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you.
Thank you, Alderman Guy. Next, we have Alderman Hussey.
David, Aileen, firstly, can I thank you both for accepting the invitation from Council to come and address, in this case, a committee of Council, but I'm sure there are others who are not on the committee, can spread the word to our main Council body. I had asked that Council would invite the Ulster Farmers Union along, and I'm absolutely delighted that you have accepted that invitation and in fact brought reality to the situation that the climate bill, as proposed by Claire Bailey, the impact that will have not alone on farmers, but on the entire rural community, and not just the rural community, the agri-food sector, and that's quite important in our council area. Not to mention the thousands of ancillary businesses in our rural communities that will be impacted by the ramifications of this. I welcome, and I trust that others can see that the farming community and your union and other associated bodies recognize the issues and don't want to be seen as part of the problem, but rather want to be part of the solution. That is what you want, and that comes over very, very clear. And I trust that people will listen and allow the farming community to be part of the solution to what is undoubtedly an issue. I noted in your presentation there that you mentioned my own party as being one of the co-signers of the Bailey Bill. I let my assembly members know my dismay at what was happening. I believe that somebody from your own neck of the woods, David, may also not have gone along the party line on that, and I'm glad of that, along with one other. But I think there has to be a realization of the true impact that this will have on our entire rural community. Later on, I see we have an issue on our agenda, which is about the race to zero. I would say to anyone, less haste and more speed. And I think it was Councillor O'Neill mentioned there, well, what's wrong sort of with 2045? I think you've outlined it perfectly there. Sure, there are targets to be met. And I think we need to be realistic and take on board what the United Kingdom Climate Change Committee has said, and I'll quote, "At this time, our assessment is that net zero targets covering all greenhouse gases cannot credibly be set for Northern Ireland." We need to take that on board and be realistic. If it is 82%, that is very challenging, undoubtedly. And if the date is 2050, so be it. But let the industry work with yourselves. Just one, thank you. I mean, all the questions have been asked and you've adequately answered them. But just one question. You mentioned the 30,000 within the wider, farmers and their families, etc. Have you any idea of how many would be impacted through the entire rural community, the agri-food sector, and those ancillary rural businesses that also have input into the agricultural production process, etc. It's much wider than that 30. I think you said 30 to 40,000. I mean, we could be up into, I don't know, 100,000, whatever. And I mean, that's me postulating, but do you have any idea of what numbers may be impacted?
Well, Derek, we actually have asked KPMG as part of that study and impact assessment to look at that. But I mean, just to give you maybe a background indication, NIFTA, which is the Northern Ireland Food and Drink Association, in their most recent report just launched earlier this year, indicated that there are 113,000 jobs in the agri-food sector. Now, those are jobs directly related to, I mean, there's about 25,000 farms roughly in Northern Ireland. As I said, some of those farm businesses are small and part-time. They're roughly around 12,000 of them are what I would describe as full-time farms, and indeed in some instances on those farms there may be an additional family member or indeed an employee. So you know, the number of employees, I'm not basing it because, let's be honest, not every farmer is a member of the Ulster Farmers Union, but we did a survey a number of years ago, and that figure that I presented to you, I think it was around about 2.6 to 2.7 people employed or actively involved in the farm per business, because much and all is, you know, we would be delighted if they all wanted to pay per person. They pay per farm, if you understand. So therefore, that's not something we have any control over. But the 113,000 figure from NIFTA is out there in the public domain, and you know, ultimately, you know, I think the fundamental problem the processors and those businesses are indicating to us is that, you know, any reduction in what a farmer does or what he produces would have a much faster, that impact might happen slower, because sadly a reflection of farmers is a lot of them love farming and enjoy what they do, so therefore they'll keep doing it until they cannot afford to do it. And fundamentally, the problem that the processors are indicating to us is that in terms of what they describe as critical mass, in other words, to run a factory, you need a certain level of beef, sheep, milk, whatever it is, coming through it. And their expectation is that any decimation of the productive level would have a very, very rapid impact in their sectors, which ultimately are jobs.
David, thank you. And Chair, can I just finish with another quote from the CCC? And I think it's a very, is a quote we need to take notice of. Setting emission reduction targets that are too ambitious to be delivered can undermine their credibility. You know, let's achieve the possible and do it in conjunction with the farming community. David Aileen, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Next indicated speaker is Alderman Ferguson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to David and Aileen for the presentation today. Our council was one of the very first councils in Northern Ireland to declare a climate emergency, and obviously it is concerning. I know that the weather like today is great, but it concerns you because it's so drastic that climate change is happening, and it's happening fast. Some of the figures that we've seen is showing that even by 2045, 2050, the damage is done. You know, we need to be drastic with some of the measures we put in place. And I appreciate some of the work our council officers have done, and they've taken an adaptation and mitigation approach with our policies. So wanted to touch with you, understandably, there's going to be a level of emissions that we have to live with, you know, day-to-day life. You know, we can't get rid of absolutely everything. So do you foresee if, for example, this private members bill did go forward and there was a focus on the new technologies that you were chatting about, that the likes of, you know, the soil and the animal feed to try and reduce the methane emissions, better fertilizers, you know, and even a levy for planting trees. Do you foresee anything that our government should be focusing on and our Stormont should be focusing on and trying to put more resources in so that we have that more drastic resources and for our farmers? Because obviously we want to do it together. We want, you know, we don't want anybody suffering, but it's also, it's right in front of us. We can see it every day. We can see it in the flash floods. We can see it in the heat that's causing havoc to our infrastructure. You know, we do have to be drastic in our commitments going forward. But I really appreciate, you know, your presentation today. I'm not from a farming background, so have very little knowledge of farming. So it's been an education for me, and I do appreciate it. But I just wanted to hear a little bit more on what you think technologies that could come forward to help out.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel, for that question. I mean, I'll come to Aileen because she's been involved in that greenhouse gas implementation group right from 2008. But just maybe one other thing which maybe failed to say, and I was reminded of it by your question, and that is, the responsibility that we as farmers and agriculture, and certainly the UFU, are putting that case to our farmers, that we have a responsibility to be part of the solution. We are part of the solution because we're the only sector, along with forestry, that can sequester and take in the carbon that is being released by other industries. But one of the main concerns that we currently have, and indeed I was part of a peatland restoration discussion just last night up in County Antrim, and what we're seeing across in Wales and Scotland is, in actual fact, the large corporates coming out of London are coming out of the cities, and basically, they're looking at obviously wanting to create a better image. They don't want to be seen to be net emitters. So therefore, what has been happening is that they are they are buying up agricultural land. They're buying up agricultural land for the sole purpose of planting it in trees. So therefore, basically what they can say is that, well, okay, we're producing, and appreciate earlier, so the details around kilotons and megatons and all the rest of it, but we're producing whatever X number of tons of CO2 and emissions. But on the other side, here we own this few thousands of acres here in South Wales or north of Scotland or wherever it might be. I mean, where that translated across, and there is every expectation, and those concerns are being expressed in the Republic of Ireland as well as here in Northern Ireland, were that to be translated across, I mean, that would have again a devastating impact on rural communities, because what you're finding is, and we're absolutely encouraging farmers to plant more trees and to plant more hedges and all of that there, but in truth, were we to see the same impact in Northern Ireland as we are seeing in Scotland and in Wales, I mean, that just basically pushes farmers out of areas. Those corporates, whether they are a high-tech company or whatever it is, if they're buying up that land, they're not putting an awful lot into the local businesses and local shops in those communities, if anything, for that matter. And in fact, actually, the view taken last night in the discussion I was part of was that, well, does that then give them the right to say, well, we don't really have to push hard in order to reduce our emissions, because we're using this amount of energy or whatever as part of some big office block in London. So fundamentally, again, the agriculture and farmland is being targeted as the solution, which I keep re-emphasizing. But it is to the detriment of the actual farmers, because they then are being pushed aside by those large corporates. But in relation to foreseeing new technologies, Aileen, if you want to come in with a few of those points, and even you referenced earlier the reduction that there has been in the dairy sector since 1990. So they're not small things that have been happening. There has been significant work done in the last 10, 12 years.
Firstly, you made a point about drastic action is being needed, and I don't think we're certainly not denying that. I think it's ensuring that drastic action is balanced and doesn't actually deliver an increase in global emissions by exporting our food elsewhere. And the key point I keep emphasizing is we still need to eat, so we need to produce food, and we need to produce food in the most sustainable and environmentally friendly way where emissions are lowest, and we believe our grass-based farming systems in Northern Ireland deliver that. So in terms of new technologies, I mean, there are certain things that can be, adopted further and support for farmers to do that, whether it's through the likes of capital grant schemes or training and education and so forth. Those are actually fairly well developed and being rolled out. There is no magic bullet, because greenhouse gas emissions from cattle and sheep are natural emissions. It's not just as simple of turning it off. The research needs to develop, but it's not just about reducing methane being produced. You then need to look at, is there a food safety issue? Is the food still, is the animal still able to produce the milk and the beef to the same level? And then, is there human health implications? So that takes an considerable amount of time to go through those trials and things. So I suppose what we would say in terms of support, there is a need for long-term research commitment. At the minute, a lot of the research commitments that come from government are on a short term, 2-3 year projects, and then you have to bid in, and it might be whatever the trend is at that time is supported. So there is a need for long-term commitments, particularly around research on climate change mitigation measures on farms. And the other thing around soils and so forth, I think there's a lot of work already being rolled out. I think it's just the need to continue to support that and recognise the benefits of that. But there isn't a quick fix, and every expert, has clearly indicated to hit that 2045 target, technology and science will not deliver enough, and that was why it will require drastic livestock reductions. But give us the time and the space to deliver those various projects and so forth. We have a chance of hitting a later target, and if enough developments are delivered, then we may get there earlier. The other thing, just to point out, the difference between 82% at 2050 and 100% or net zero at 2045 only delivers a difference of 0.73% in UK emissions. It is not significant really in terms of the drastic consequences, and in fact that 0.73% is actually questionable because it maybe does not take into account the carbon leakage if food is imported from elsewhere. So it's a very complex issue, and it's one where you need to take advice from the independent experts rather than just picking a target out of the air because it sounds good and might deliver a few votes. We would be urging everybody to look at the independent expert advice that's been given and base the pathway forward on that.
Aileen, wise words. Councillor Edwards.
Chair, thanks for letting me in. I want to thank Aileen and David for their presentations. I've been fortunate enough over the last number of years to meet up with the UFU a number of times, especially at my show, and I hope it's back up and going next year. But Chair, this is a very complex issue, and I'm not going to pretend that I understand it all, but I know that it's a very difficult balance to strike. I do come from an agricultural background, and like yourself, Chair, represent the rural DEA, so I do have massive sympathy and concern for agricultural community and our rural communities. But I also understand there's the important need to have greenhouse gas emissions targets in the north, and after all, we are facing a climate emergency. But I think Aileen may have answered it in the last question, but I just wanted to ask about some of the initiatives that are currently out there to reduce emissions among our farms, because I know that some farms are a bit more emissions efficient than others, and I was going to ask about the knowledge sharing as well, because I did hear, although I'm not over the detail, that there's some maybe open farms, something like that, some sort of initiative where farmers can go and learn, these sort of new practices and reducing emissions. So I'm wondering if Aileen and David could comment on that a bit. And just on a final personal note, I do hope that there's a realistic approach taken when these bills do get the committee stage in Stormont, that will mitigate as much as possible an impact on our rural communities and on our agricultural sector, but also dealing with the concerns around climate change. And I know that's definitely not going to be easy, but I do hope a realistic approach is taken. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, for your question. I'll maybe start and then hand over to Aileen as well. There are a number of initiatives. I don't know if you're aware or not, because this started probably in the wider sectors of beef, sheep and cattle and so forth, dairy and all the rest of it, was business development groups. Those were further developed in the past year or 18 months into environmental business development groups. Those groups are groups of farmers. So what you're talking about there in terms of peer learning is very much integral to the work that CAFRE, the College of Agriculture, Food and Rural Enterprise, does amongst our farming community. It's something we absolutely support and promote as an Ulster Farmers Union, because ultimately what they're doing is helping other farmers to understand. And part of that has been carbon audits. those have been rolled out in the last 12 months or so on those farms who have signed up to that. I have every expectation that carbon audits will become something that it will be a familiar term to our industry in the years going forward. Whenever we start to roll this out much more wide than just those business development groups. The other thing, and maybe this is what you're thinking of, was AgResearch, which is an agricultural research group, have rolled out beacon farms, and those are again part of peer learning. But I'll maybe hand over to Aileen to if you want to say a wee bit maybe about that and Arc Zero as well, those projects.
Yeah, so Beacon Farms and Arc Zero will look at sort of trying to see whether individual farms can get to net zero. Now that's very different from a legislative target, but I mean there are lots of different initiatives that are taking place. The other one I think maybe that you referred to is there's technology demonstration farms where farmers will be able to visit, hopefully in person in due course, and see a fellow farmer, delivering something, but in terms of reducing emissions and so forth. But I think it is important to say that the technologies will not deliver us the extent, anywhere near the legislative targets that are being set. There will be further actions needed on that, beyond that. So it's a really good start. And we as an organisation also, we have limited resources, but we are trying to run webinars and signpost people towards the likes of the advice and schemes and different events that others are organising. So again, in this year of the COP26, we're working actually across the UK with the UK farming unions and running different events and webinars to try and raise awareness of various actions that can be taken on farms. And we're hoping to run a major conference in October time again to highlight some of the positive work that's being done and also raise awareness of the whole issue as well with farmers and the wider public as well.
And just because it's been mentioned a couple of times earlier on, Castlederg, in the middle of August, it is our intention as an Ulster Farmers Union, and we have invited and they have accepted that invitation, the ERA committee, to bring them down to a farm, Jessica Pollock's farm in Castlederg. She was runner-up in the competition basically around this whole COP26, which we're all hearing quite a bit about. And we were promoting environmental good practice. So believe it or not, that farm that did well in that competition is in Castlederg. So credit to that.
The weather's as good then as it is now, anyway.
Hope so.
Our final
hope we can all get an invite.
Councillor Kelly, I think you're the last indicated speaker.
Thank you, Chair, and just thanks to David and to Aileen for the presentation. I did miss a little bit of some of the contributions, but I did get the presentation and it was very comprehensive and very informative, and that's always very useful to get that kind of information at this stage. And I look forward to the expansion of that information that's being presented whenever the KPMG report comes out, and look forward to reading that. And I think, whilst I agree with some of the members and disagree with other members, I think one of the things that this members' bill, which my own party has signed up to, is that it kind of has forced people to think and look very hard, even doing the KPMG report, commissioning that body of work, to look at just the ins and outs and the intricacies of farming practices. What are the positives, what are the negatives, and what of farming industry in this day and age as a single part of the overall contribution across that every single one of us has to play in terms of mitigating and reducing the impact on climate. And I'm a Sperrin councillor, and I'm reminded, sitting here today, and we have a weather warning for a heat wave that we've never experienced before. It's never. This is new. The levels of heat that we're experiencing, and I think back to 2017 and the floods that we had in the Sperrins, the devastating impact of those floods. And it's very clear from talking to farmers, because the average age of farmers here, unfortunately, is very high currently. But one of the advantages in terms of that high age bracket is the wisdom that they have accrued over a long number of years. and they have never seen or experienced weather patterns or climate like this. So they are very invested in the process. Now, I know the bill as it stands has created a sort of Armageddon sort of scenario for some of the people talking. I don't think what is presented by in the Clare Bailey bill will, if it goes through all of the processes, will go through the consultation, will take on amendments from the ERA committee and what have you. All of those processes. I think that the end bill won't look exactly. They never do what it does now as whenever they're submitted. So I think it's important that we kind of, you know, be sensible about this. We need to set sensible and ambitious targets, but ones that are achievable. And I think we will end up doing that. And I think, you know, the evidence that's been accrued, not just from the Ulster Farmers Union, but from various other bodies as well, will feed into that. And I think we will see a sensible outcome and a just transition going forward. As it stands, I have to say, Chair, I'm more concerned in the short term, and I'm talking, you know, within 5 to 10 years, of the impact of some of the Brexit trade negotiations that the UK government have entered into, and the impacts that will have on our farming community than it would have on the longer term, you know, 2050 targets around climate change. So thank David. I don't really have any questions. Any question I had has been answered. So I just want to thank them for that and look forward to the ongoing engagement as we progress down this road. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Maybe just if I could, Chair, if I could just quickly say, I mean, I absolutely share those major concerns around the trade implications because despite kind words, we judge by the actions of the UK government, their view on trade, and it is certainly pursuing that cheap food policy regardless of climate or indeed standards of food quality. So we share that concern with you. I mean, and I absolutely agree with you. We need sensible and achievable targets. I think the distinction probably for agriculture, and it has probably become the headline amongst this whole climate change bill. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we can all be thrown out of our diesel cars or petrol cars and put into electric cars. Our oil heating boilers seem to have a limited life expectancy, you know, because obviously there are changes needed there in terms of the fossil fuels that we're burning. But I suppose we keep repeating this, you know, the processes in terms of food production will have emissions. I think actually one of the major concerns I have is that as other sectors, if we continue to make the comparison on a percentage basis, I think that will be to the detriment of agriculture, because ultimately the other sectors may be able to move faster. But I think, just to repeat what Aileen said a number of times, was give us the time. We're not deniers of climate change. We absolutely see the need to work towards our contribution, and in the words of the chair of the CCC, a fair and equitable contribution to the 82% target that has been set for the UK. But thank you for your time. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, David and Aileen, both for presenting to the council today, and indeed thank members for their comments and questions. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did in terms of what I learned today, which is certainly a very important issue, and one that no doubt we'll be hearing more of in the future as it becomes more and more pertinent. So David and Aileen, just to say thanks again on behalf of the Regeneration Committee, and hopefully you'll get to enjoy the rest of the sun this evening. So thank you both.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Council.
Councillor O'Neill, were you looking to make a proposal on the back of that presentation?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It was just, I know that kind of when this had originally been proposed, there had been a proposal to invite the Nature Friendly Farming Network in, but I know that they you know, they couldn't come. So it was just to invite Farmers for Action. I know it's just another group, a farming group, who had supported the bill. So it was just to hear, from farmers who are supporting the climate change bill. And just because I wasn't specific about that group, they couldn't come, they couldn't be invited until I was specific about it. Yeah, well, I put it in the chat box. Sorry. So I'll propose Farmers for Action to come and present on their take on the private member climate bill.
Yeah, and have we got a seconder for that?
Happy to second it, Chair.
Councillor Jackson.
Yeah.
I take it members were content enough with the proposal that's going to be put in the box here. Don't hear any.
Chair, if members are happy with that, we can organise that.
Yeah, okay. And if Councillor O'Neill just puts that in the box,
sorry.
Continue. Just note there, Alderman Hussey's comment there, asking that the KPMG report be shared with councillors when it's available. Sure that can be actioned as well, Karen.
Yeah, Chair, we can follow up on that. And as members had alluded to earlier, I know our teams had tried to make contact with Ulster Farmers Union in the past and hadn't actually had a lot of luck trying to engage them, but it's great to see David and Aileen and now have their contact details, and so we will be able to engage with them directly in terms of the council initiatives moving forward, and certainly we can make contact and ask them for a copy of that when it's available. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Karen, and Councillor O'Neill has that on the chat box there. Members, if we're content, we'll move on then to item 6, which is chair's business. You will be pleased to hear I don't have any specific chair's business. So I'll move to item 7, which is matters arising from the open minutes of our previous meeting held on Wednesday the 16th of June. And so matters arising, I'll take from pages 15 to 30. And 30 to 48.
For accuracy, Chair, or?
No, matters arising, we take accuracy at full council, isn't that
Oh,
right,
sorry. So, okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what page it is. Sorry, ER 201/21.
Go ahead.
It's just around the play parks. And it was just the play park that's being redeveloped in Eglinton. It was just to ask the question if there's going to be a zebra crossing incorporated to access that play park for, to cross that road, obviously in Eglinton, for the safety of those entering and exiting the park. I know I might be able to answer that right now, and that's fine.
Yeah, Chair, if you're happy, we'll go back to Councillor O'Neill directly on that. I just don't have that information in front of me at the minute.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay. Any other member under matters arising there? If not, I suppose we move on to item 8 then, which is street naming and property numbering. Request for development name.
And Frank will take this one, Chair, if you're happy to, Frank.
Yes, members, this is a item to the name of the development on White House Road, Derry. As you'll see from the paper, the proposed name is Willow Way, and that's acceptable in terms of the policy. So the recommendations, members' approval is hereby sought for the adoption of the name Willow Way for the housing development White House Road, Derry.
So proposed, Chair.
Proposed, Councillor, who was that?
Brian Tierney.
Sorry, Councillor Tierney proposed. Need a seconder, members?
Seconded, Chair.
Councillor Alderman Ferguson, seconded. Next item is also street naming. Take it, it's Frank again.
Yep. Members, this is the outcome of 5 different streets where a bilingual signage request was received, and those are Avery Park, Newton Stewart, Celia's Walk, Derry, Colleen Park, Derry, Jacqueline Way, Derry, Lonmore Road, Derry. The outcomes are set out in the report, and the recommendation is, given the outcome of the plebiscite, members are asked to approve the erection of bilingual signage, street signage at Avery Park, Newton Stewart, Celia's Walk, Colleen Park, Jacqueline Way, and Lonmore Road, Derry.
Thanks, Frank. Over to you, members.
Chair, I proposed that on the chat box there.
Yeah, just seeing that now, John. Thank you.
Right, thanks.
Councillor Burke, are you looking on there?
The proposal rather have been off the second. It just right. Thanks.
Members, item 10 is raised to 0, but remiss of me, I should have said earlier there, item 13 for information is a regional energy strategy, but I think that needs an endorsement of a recommendation, so we'll take that after item 10 if members are content. So item 10 is raised to 0.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take this. And members, the purpose of this report is to seek members' approval for Council to become a member of the United Nations Race to Zero and Race to Resilience campaigns. And members, this supports our Climate Emergency Declaration of July 2019 and our Climate Emergency Pledge in July 2020. And really, members, in terms of the background, the Race to Zero is an umbrella campaign and that aggregates commitments to become net zero, absolute zero, or climate positive from a range of leading networks and initiatives. And the Race to Resilience is a global campaign to rally leadership and support from businesses, cities, regions, and investors for healthy, resilient, zero carbon recovery. And members, in terms of progress, the process is laid out in section 2.3 of your report in terms of how we would go about this. And in terms, members, of key issues, members, you will probably be aware the high-level climate champions require the commitment brought forward to meet a set of common criteria to join the Race to Zero. And many of these, members, we are already undertaken through our existing initiatives in Council, and they are laid out in section 3 of your report, and they relate to making pledges, plans, proceeding with action, publishing progress, and then relating to our leadership practices, and again focusing on empowerment and equality. And really, members, Council, as you may be aware, hosted a visit to the city from the United Nations UK high-level climate change champion for climate action, Nigel Toppin, on the 3rd of June 2021. And during that meeting, the Mayor and Council officers outlined Council's progress to date and our climate action commitments. And members, you will be aware that we have also taken part in the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy and the Glasgow Food and Climate Declaration, which these issues relate. So members, in terms of implications, applying to join the Race to Zero and Race to Resilience, it renews our commitment to tackling the climate emergency. And also, there aren't specific financial legal implications associated with this at this time. And members, we are seeking, therefore, that you approve that we can go ahead and apply to become members of the Race to Zero and Race to Resilient campaigns. I'm happy to take any questions that members have or any comments.
Thanks for that, Karen. I have a couple indicated speakers here with Councillor Jackson first.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Karen, for the presentation or for the report. And as Karen has outlined, all the benefits in terms of it, it does align with our previous commitments around our reducing our carbon footprint, with around our declaration of climate emergency and our climate emergency pledge. So in that we all are in line. I'm happy to propose that we accept the recommendation, and I propose the recommendation that we do apply, because I know we've spent almost 2 hours discussing the importance of reducing our impact on the environment, and as a council, we've got a major role along with everybody else in terms of showing leadership and taking action. As I suppose in terms of that race to zero, they try and reverse the damage that has been done to our environment, that's been that we're seeing played out in the climate right across the world today. So on behalf of Sinn Féin, we believe that this is a good step, it's an important step, and it'll help us on our pathway to zero. So happy to propose that we go down this route and apply to take part in this project. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Chris. Councillor Tierney.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to Karen for the report. And I'm happy to second the recommendation that we do apply to become members of the Race to Zero campaign. If we're serious about taking climate action and addressing the climate emergency, then I think it's important that we are part of this global organisation, which is going to address some of the key issues. I was mayor during the meeting with Nigel Topping. And it was very clear during that meeting, and I know it's outlined within the report, but it was very clear during that meeting that a lot of the things that they're looking for us to do, we're already doing or planning to implement in the very near future. So I think it's a good stepping stone for us, where we can learn from other people's experience, but also teach as well in terms of how we have made those changes within our local community. So I'm happy to second the recommendation. But Chair, just one question. I know it states in the report that there are at this time, no financial commitments in applying to become members, but I'm wondering, is Karen or any of the officers aware of any future financial commitments in relation to joining the Race to Zero? Thank you, Chair.
Chair, I'm happy to take that, and members know we aren't aware of any at this stage. Clearly, members are wider commitments around climate emergency, as members will know, and members have asked us now to include on all of our committee reports. Clearly, they will have implications for council moving forward in terms of the way in which we develop our policies, and indeed the way in which we undertake our business. But they're not specific to this Race to Zero at the minute. And members, we will bring back to you, as we said, in all the committee reports, implications around climate and indeed the associated, if any, financial implications. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Karen. I have Councillor O'Neill, then followed by Alderman Hussey. Councillor O'Neill.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Karen, for bringing the report. I obviously, and People for Profit, obviously welcome anything that's going to strengthen our commitment to addressing the climate crisis and the already great work that Council's doing with regards to our climate change plan and the biodiversity work and the zero waste circular economy. So anything that can create and support more action and more urgent action in the climate crisis is so welcome. I just wanted to ask Karen what other municipalities or organisations are part of this Race to Zero campaign, just who else is involved, and is there opportunities for learning from, I'm sure there are opportunities from learning best practice in other places, but are there any immediate opportunities in that way? Thank you.
Yeah, Chair, if I quickly come in there, and members, as we outlined in the report, this is very much a global campaign, relates to all sectors. So there are industries, there are municipalities, there are cities across the world that are involved in this. And certainly, I think one of the purposes of the visit by the ambassador to the city was to try and encourage more people to take part. So our climate and climate manager and our energy manager have engaged with that with a view to start that engagement and dissemination of best practice. So we will do that, and members, if it will be helpful moving forward, we can bring a further report back to members in terms of what we have seen the benefits of being part of this movement are to members as we move forward, and certainly move forward into the COP26, which members are aware of, is in Scotland in November. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Karen. Alderman Hussey.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Karen. Under 3.1, a couple of issues. Scope. Can you enlarge upon scope? Are we talking internal council here, or are we talking of all of those bodies within the district council area? And quite appropriate that we have the sinks and credits section there as well, having heard what we heard from the UFU about the fact that the credits that they accumulate are not actually awarded to their sector. So I think that fits in quite well with the previous presentation. And when we talk about proceed, it says take immediate action. I'm always aware of the physics nature of things, that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Whilst we talk about race, I would be more concerned, less speed or less haste and more speed. That we're aware when we propose an action that we investigate the reaction. I mean, the situation, again, going back to the earlier presentation, if we cut down on our food production, what is the impact that will then have in another area? For example, Brazil, will more of the rainforest be cleared to allow cattle to graze or whatever? So it's action and reaction within all of this. Will that be part of the considerations of this race to zero and race to resilience going forward? Thank you, Chair.
Chair, if I just come in and answer those queries, and certainly members, what we're asking of you today is that Council themselves take part in this initiative, and I suppose that really relates to the scope of our own Council services and actions. Clearly, we are also, as you know, a leader within the local area, and we seek to encourage others to do their bit, but this relates, members, to Council. And certainly, members, absolutely, I think really in terms of our taking urgent action, we clearly will, as we said, have already moved to looking at climate implications of all of our policies of Council, and that be brought to members through your committee reports, to all committees, not just Environment and Regeneration Committee. So increasingly, members, you will see that moving forward, and absolutely 100% it does need to, we do need to consider all of the wider implications, members, in terms of undertaking any action that may result in a reduction in zero carbon emissions, because clearly that could have a knock-on effect elsewhere. And so, members, really, as you'll be aware in your implications part of your committee reports, they relate to equality, rural needs, climate change, and data protection. So basically all of those issues should be considered as we move forward to make sure that any decision that members are making and the council takes is balanced, and members will be fully aware, following on from previous committee reports, that council has got a commitment to just transition and making sure that the proper support is put in place for all of the stakeholders who are moving forward in this process, and certainly we will seek to do that as best we can moving forward. So members, I think that's answered the questions. And again, thanks and credits, yes, absolutely. And members, you know, that's something that clearly we are undertaking at the minute, is in terms of mapping our emissions you know, impact on the environment, and indeed what we can do and what we are doing to mitigate against that as an organisation, and as against the services that we have as well. So certainly happy to take members' comments on board. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks, members. Members, the recommendation has been proposed by Councillor Jackson, seconded by Councillor Tierney. I'm sensing that there's nobody against the recommendation. So, members, I'll move on then to our next item, which has been brought out of items for information, and that's the Regional Energy Strategy. And that's Karen again.
Thank you, Chair. And members, the purpose of this report is to present to you the Northwest Regional Energy Strategy and to seek your endorsement to continue to deliver the decarbonisation roadmap for the region. Members, you will be aware, and especially members who may also sit on the Northwest Regional Development Group, that regionally we have worked together with our partners in Donegal County Council to identify the challenges to the local environment from climate change and the need to live sustainably. And I wish to have these contribution as well as the development of sustainable transport system and to the contribution of a sustainable energy strategy could make in terms of.
You're definitely with me there. I'm not sure about all members.
Sorry, am I breaking up?
It's the same for me as well, Chair.
If you try without your camera, Karen, sometimes that can resolve it if you just have the mic.
Sorry, Chair. Sorry, Chair. I will. Is that better?
The mic or your camera's off now. Yeah, it seems to be.
Is it a little? Is it a bit better, Chair?
Yeah, it seems to be.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So, Chair, the councils recognise the contribution of a sustainable energy strategy could make in terms of cost savings, but also green jobs, and as a catalyst to delivering a green transformation in the Northwest City region. And therefore, the councils had committed to addressing the challenges. And members, we sought sort of a number of years ago to actually develop a Northwest Regional Energy Strategy, and made an application in 2018 for funding through the Northwest Regional Development Group to develop such a strategy. And we then appointed an energy coordinator to develop the strategy. And it was developed over a 2-year period, engaging stakeholders on both sides of the border in shaping the strategy through a series of stakeholder events. And the outcome of the strategy was a roadmap identifying short, medium and long-term objectives to achieve net zero carbon by 2045 within the energy sector, by analysing 5 main themes, and that's energy efficiency, smart energy management, low carbon heating, renewable generation, and energy storage and low carbon transport. So a regional carbon footprint analysis was also completed, and a carbon mapping tool developed to measure the reductions in carbon as projects are developed in line with the roadmap timeline. And it was the strategy has been presented and endorsed by the Northwest Regional Development Group. And separately, a cross-border regional energy agency is being established to look at how we take forward the roadmap and deliver this strategy. And in parallel, work continues to apply for funding from the Northern Ireland Executive, UK governments, the Irish government and the EU to establish and maintain the energy agency and actually take these projects forward. So members, in terms of implications, we aren't asking for any financial commitment from Council today in terms of this particular strategy, but clearly, as we are aware, taking the strategy forward in the coming years will require funding from a number of different sources. So members, we are asking you today to note the contents of the report, endorse the regional energy strategy and support the establishment of a regional energy agency. Chair, I'm happy to take any comments or queries that members have.
Thank you, Karen. Have Councillor Kelly indicated here.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to Karen for the report. Yes, I have no issue. We have no issue with the broad thrust of what's presented in the report, and I'm happy to note the contents and endorse the proposal for the agency. I do have a question, Chair, just in relation to, I suppose it's 3.1 and 3.2 of the report in terms of developing energy infrastructure, and the reference there to the predominantly rural settings with large renewable energy source potential. And I'm just a wee bit concerned around that because I wasn't sure if any audit or any assessment done of the predominantly rural areas of the district, either ourselves or Donegal, in terms of what would be appropriate, what would meet statutory standards and all the rest of it. So I'm a little bit concerned that there seems to be a steer within the report that that we could see as a result of this huge renewable energy sites just popping up across the rural parts of the district. That does concern me, and I would appreciate maybe if that could be picked up by someone just to address that point. That's not what we're about, that it's going to be done in a measured way, because it goes on to mention that part of the strategy is around the high cost of energy bills. And since I've come onto the council in 2011, the big push from that time around, particularly in wind energy, was twofold. One was around green energy, and the other was addressing fuel poverty. And whilst we have seen a huge increase, an exponential increase in the number of wind farms, particularly wind farms, but some solar farms as well, we haven't seen anywhere near the same impact in terms of fuel poverty, and we have got some of the highest energy bills in Europe. So a little bit concerned that we just kind of keep expanding the number of energy sites, but the issue around fuel poverty has not been addressed. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, Chair, if I just come in and comment on that, and certainly, Chair, that particular issue and I suppose concern did come up throughout the consultation, and certainly there is no agenda in the development of the strategy in order to focus primarily on additional infrastructure in the rural area in terms of renewable energy. Clearly there is a need to focus on a very balanced approach and look at some of the other sort of, I suppose, emerging technologies, and indeed really focus very much on all of the objectives around energy efficiency, smart energy management, low carbon heating, as well as renewable generation, and then energy storage and low carbon transport. So certainly we would see this strategy and this plan being very balanced and indeed clearly taken into consideration the strategic positions of the councils around you know, the sensitive nature of the landscape in the district, etc. So certainly members, just to reassure you on that point, and you know, I'm sure that this debate and indeed our solutions will feature in as we move forward on into the development stage of the actual strategy. So I hope, members, that's covered the query so far.
Thanks, Karen. Alderman Hussey.
Thank you, Chair. I see that Karen said cover the queries so far. Yep, and agreeing with Councillor Kelly there. I mean, he's preempted my own thoughts on it. We're aware that at times there is conflict between the energy providers and community, particularly with regard to wind farms, etc. So thank you, Karen, for covering that. On Councillor Kelly's point with regard to supposed cheaper energy, I mean, as a customer of one of the firms, I'm aware that they've actually raised their prices, and they're a so-called green energy firm. They've raised their prices for the second time within 12 months, and we can anticipate more of that. So Councillor Kelly is quite correct to mention that particular point. Within 2.2, I note that the council is jointly seeking to address the challenges posed by decoupling of economic growth from resource use. Not that long ago at a meeting, myself and I think maybe Councillor Jackson may have been on the same vein as myself, that rather than exporting the green energy that is produced in our own area, that we should be ensuring that business, you know, and this gets rid of the grid connection issues as well, that we should be persuading industry to come to where the energy is and utilising the fact that the green energy exists within our area to promote economic growth by bringing the industry to where the energy is. So just that comment on that particular section on 2.2, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Councillor O'Neill.
Thank you, Karen, for that summary. It's a massive bit of work, so well done to everybody who was involved in doing it. I suppose just on the back of the last two councillors' points there around, and I suppose in particular the new renewable technologies within rural communities and even within urban communities. You know, does this report account for community-owned energy production? You know, where communities then, rather than big private companies, produce the energy and get the profits from it, and then can sell excess energy off to the grid. And then just around a just transition for workers and you know, the fossil fuel and carbon producing energy industries, and how to support workers you know, into more renewable energy systems, so that workers and those carbon producing industries don't lose their jobs, but instead are reskilled and supported. So it is a massive report. Those things might be in there, but just if you knew anything on that, Karen. I know that in Council's response to DERA on the energy consultation, those things were included. Thank you.
Yeah, through you, Chair, certainly that is the case. And I think really when we discussed the strategy at the Northwest Regional Development Group, certainly I know that you know, a sustainable energy community is already being established. I think actually, in fact, 2 within Donegal, and there was a commitment to look at mirroring that within the Derry City and Strabane District Council area, to look, you know, how communities could take more ownership of these issues, and indeed how we and the wider stakeholders and partners that will develop the strategy, because clearly the strategy is not just for council, it's for all our wider partners and stakeholders to deliver, can support communities in taking forward district heating schemes, microgrids, and other types of initiatives that will support them to actually develop and produce and potentially export to the grid their energy, and certainly that is what we envisage moving forward. Certainly, yes, absolutely, in terms of a just transition and skills within the sector is something that has been considered, and we have looked, as you would have heard in our response last month to the Northern Ireland strategy, to look to engage with our further and higher education colleges to look at how some of those particular skills can be developed locally, and certainly to learn from best practice elsewhere. So, members, I hope that covers the issues, and certainly, endorsing the strategy and moving forward, it really is the start of the process, whilst members are aware that there are numerous strands of work ongoing, and that we have been very successful over the last number of years in terms of being able to get European funding to help us sort of look at best practice and start to implement some smaller scale projects. Really what we need is the major shift, because clearly in order to actually get to a zero emissions energy sector by 2045 is certainly very, very challenging in its own right. And some of the comments made earlier on. So certainly, members are happy to take any further questions that you may have.
Thank you, Karen. Councillor Kelly had proposed the recommendation there, members, but I don't think anybody has seconded there, and since this
Happy to
is
second, Chair Derek here.
Thank you, Derek. I'm sensing this is unanimous endorsement as well, so it has been proposed and seconded. So, members, our next items are all for information, and unless anybody has any pressing matter that they need to raise on it, I would propose that we would move to confidential for decision.
Chair, I think there's a couple of members that have come in there.
Yeah. I'll take them as they've indicated in the chat box here. Alderman Hussey, item 18.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to propose the recommendation with regard to an original grant, but there were a couple of issues that it brings to mind with regard to cemeteries, and I presume the Upper Humber Cemetery, Claudy, is one of the older cemeteries. By the way, I've already been engaging with Karen on this one, so she has a wee bit of background on it. If I can go back to the March meeting of E&R to item ER 7821, Chair. On 4.1, there was an extension to the pollinator policy areas, and that brought in 19 of the older cemetery sites. 4.2 on that, council were saying that they were cutting a 3-meter strip of mown grass adjacent to paths within or around the wildflower meadows, and indeed a 3-meter path through the wildflower meadow where it was appropriate. But it also said it was not necessary in cemeteries, as these are areas not used by the public. Karen is aware, and I appreciate and thank Karen and other officers for the responses on this. I have had a few queries reference a couple of the cemeteries where people were attending to graves within particular graveyards, namely at Corrick, Donaghady, and indeed Ernie Old Cemetery. And I understand that the policy will be for review, I think, after a cut has been done on these old cemeteries. But I do think that we need, during that review, to be aware that even though these are old and perhaps defined as closed cemeteries, there will be family members who do attend to the graves in these particular sites. I know at the Ernie site, a path was cut through to one of the graves to allow family members who regularly would attend that particular family grave. But that sort of respect needs to be maintained and taken on board when we review the policy going forward. And I thank Karen and officers for what has happened. But just to be aware going forward on the policy, that within the review we need to be mindful when we say that the sites aren't used by the public. There may not be burials anymore, but there will be family members, even if they're coming from not within the district but from further afield, who would want to attend graves within these older sites. So something that to be attended to within the review. As I say, Karen is aware of my concerns on that. One other issue that has arisen with regard to cemeteries, and I'm being a bit of a tangent here, Chair, I hope you'll allow me. I've been told that there's a possibility that the Cemetery House in Castlederg Cemetery may be up for sale. One of the concerns I have there is the garage, part of the garages at that particular site would be used for storage by grounds maintenance within the area. And also the cemetery toilet is located at that site, and indeed the tap for use by those who wish to water flowers on graves, etc. If that site does eventually go for sale, is there a guarantee that there will be a replacement of the storage area for grounds maintenance of the cemetery, and indeed a properly refurbished or new toilet built appropriate to the site with a water facility retained on that particular site going forward? That's if the overall site is for sale. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, through you, Chair, just to come back on that and to thank Alderman Hussey for those comments, and certainly we will take on board the concerns of families in the rural areas in terms of reviewing our Don't Mow, Let It Grow campaign in the coming weeks and months. And certainly, members, we have not made any decision on that asset to this time, and certainly we would bring a report to yourselves if we were proposing to do so, and certainly we would want to consider all of those issues in terms of facilities for our staff and for indeed for members of the public in any decision that's being made. So,
that's appreciated, Karen. Thank you.
Yeah, Chair, I think we probably need a seconder for this report.
Yeah.
Sorry, I apologise.
Yeah, Alderman.
I'll second that, Chair.
That's Councillor Jackson seconded it there. Members, just for your information as well, I think we'll take a quick 10-minute comfort break after we deal with these items of information. Next on the list we have, a second here. We have Alderman Ramsey, item 15.
Thank you, Chair. Just on item 15, just to thank the officers for bringing forward this paper and the fact that the Rossdowney Park, which is one of the major issues we've had, and there's been a lot of anger in the area at the fact that they've lost their park without any consultation. And it's just, this will be very reassuring and will obviously make people a lot happier around Lincoln Courts and Rossdowney and indeed other parts of Gilfellyn, including Woodburn. The fact that it's been rescored, it went from red to very red because there really is no park anymore. So we look forward on the key issues. The recommendation under consideration for Rossdowney Play Park to either be fully upgraded as a play area, relocate to beside Lincoln Courts Community Centre. As councillors on the ground, myself and Halloran Atlantic, we know, well, we're probably preempting, but I think we know the outcome of that. The general feeling in the area is Rossdowney Play Park be replaced with a new park. The community consultation obviously has to be undertaken, and we look forward to being involved in that and helping with it and making sure that people have their say. So just to once again thank the officers, and we look forward to letting the local community know that things are moving, and we hopefully will move. We talked earlier there about speed, and this one we would really appreciate speed. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alderman Ramsey. Alderman Hussey, you're looking on the same item.
Yeah, it's just a very brief comment. Yourself and indeed other Derry councillors will be aware of a very similar situation at Killen, just outside Castlederrig, where the play park is scored, but is closed and unusable. So I trust the same attention will be paid to that site as is given to this Rustowney site. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Derek. Declared interest there in item 12 from Councillor Jackson. Moving on now to Councillor Burke on item 17. Councillor Burke there. In the meantime, we'll move to Councillor Tierney.
Thanks, Chair. It's just in relation to the Rustowney Play Park, and I suppose it's on the back of some of the comments that Alderman Ramsey has made, and I'm just wondering, and I suppose it's just really for my own knowledge, if it is recommended and an outcome of the community consultation that Rustowney Play Park be replaced and not moved down beside Lincoln Courts, does that have to go through the Capital Development Group, or does that, because it has been removed and it's been replaced and repaired, well, maybe repaired is the wrong word, but because it's been replaced, does that supersede the capital review list, or what way does that work?
Chair, through you, members, all capital spend of council does require to be agreed by the capital working group. There isn't any capital programme that's not considered by the working group, and certainly members, we bring forward the recommendations to the group depending on the circumstances. I do know that there's a meeting of the group next week, and John will go through sort of, I suppose, the wider strategy and for members, but certainly there's no, we don't have, and this is probably what we need to agree moving forward, is renewal of I suppose assets that are very coming to the end of their life, and what our strategy is around that, and that's part of the conversation around our strategy for capital development within council. So members, there'll be an opportunity to discuss that further next week at the members capital working group as we move forward.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Members, Councillor Burke has contacted me. She doesn't wish to raise an item any longer. So, members, before we go into our confidential, we'll take a quick break. We'll have members back here at, see what time it is now, it's 25 to 7. So, we'll say 15 minutes, 10 to 7, members.
Chair, do you need a proposal now to go into confidential?
Yeah, it's probably better to, all right.
I do that then.
Seconded, Chair. Derek.
Thanks, John and Derek. Okay, members, see you back here 10 to 7.
Thank you.